So I'm going to start off with a sort of overview of the sorts of things that reviewers are going to be looking out for generally across your methods section. It's about reviewers' expectations and their concerns and how you can sort of handle those concerns when you're talking to them or, conveying information to them. So if you recall yesterday, we talked about the 4 key propositions in a grant proposal. It's important, success, value, and competence propositions. The method section is very much dealing with whether the project can answer the question, so the success criterion. So you're probably all familiar with what's in a method section, but these are the sorts of things we see. Obviously, the study design, the actual design. The setting. So many of us would like to have this sort of setting. In fact, I did have a colleague many years ago who was studying, I think, dolphins in Hawaii for a PhD, and I thought, yeah, that would be a good place to go. This is probably a more likely setting for us, a hospital or a healthcare setting of some sort, or a social care setting. That the people who are going to be involved, so the sample that you're going to take, and then how you're going to sample those people, or whatever it is you're sampling. Sometimes projects will have interventions. They may be being developed, they may be being evaluated. There'll be some form of data collection that you'll be undertaking. You'll be using various measures, which you'll be collecting that data on. You'll be undertaking data analysis of some sort. And there will be a whole project planning sort of element to it, so making sure that it all fits together. So we talked a little bit yesterday about what a research grant application, the research sections look like that you're asked to give. The method section will vary according to funder, but it usually includes these sorts of things. I will say that there are some funders, I think it's either MRC or Wellcome, who are quite bitty. So, they'll want you to put your stats in a different section to everything else. But one way or another, they'll be wanting you to cover these sorts of areas. So firstly, your study design, so details of randomization, if you've got it, allocation and blinding, if those are relevant. If you do have an intervention, you have to describe it, plus the comparator, which is something that people quite often forget to do. You want to describe the setting, sampling, sample size and recruitment, outcome measures, data collection, data analysis, and project management. So what do reviewers care about? Okay, so the first thing they care about is, will the methods proposed answer the research question? They want to make sure that the design you've got fits the question, that the methods you've got will answer what you're intending it to answer, and they will be looking out for that throughout. They'll want to know whether they are appropriate and whether they are scientifically rigorous. They'll want to know whether they're feasible, so they will be looking at your logistics as well. And they'll want to know whether, at the end of the day, they will deliver useful outputs. And we talked yesterday about the dreaded word count, and it's a real art to get that balance between sufficient detail within the word count that you're offered. And it is an art. It is an art. But there will be certain bits of information that reviewers will need in order to make an assessment of your work. So basically, to hark back to our literary interludes yesterday, we don't want this. We don't want a house of straw or hay that's going to be blown down by a mean wolfish reviewer. We want a nice brick, solid research design and methods that a reviewer can't, penetrate in terms of criticism. It's important throughout to demonstrate your thinking. So remember that funders don't usually interview, and if they do, it's further down the line, usually when you've got through several other hoops. So it's important to answer all the questions that might be asked of your written application. I think there's a tendency for people to say, oh, I better not mention that because it's a weakness of the study design. Actually, I'm afraid your reviewers will pick up on all the weaknesses of your study design. They've been doing it for years. And when you see panels in operation, they'll dive into every little crevice that you provide. So it's important to be upfront about any shortcomings or limitations of the study, to preempt criticism and to confront it and say, I know this bit is a bit weak, but you know what, I'm doing this and this will mitigate it. So you do your best to mitigate shortcomings of designs. You can discuss strengths over alternative approaches. So if you're using a particular design and there are alternatives, you can say, I'm using this because in this particular context, this is by far the best thing. Or, you may have a sort of design issue where perhaps there's a problem with contamination. So you're justifying a cluster design over an individually randomized trial, for example. But I think the thing to bear in mind is that there is rarely a perfect method, that every research design and every set of methods will have its shortcomings, will have its limitations. And as a writer of a grant application, you have to be cognizant of all of them, because reviewers will spot deficiencies, and what they'll be looking for is that you understand what they are and you're taking whatever measures that you can to limit those problems. So be upfront. Don't hide things under the carpet. So firstly, thinking about study design and the sorts of things that reviewers will be looking for there. So what will reviewers ask? Well, the first thing is the design clear? So do they know what you're doing? Have you stated this is a randomized controlled trial or this is a realist evaluation? So have you said up front what the design is? Secondly, will the design answer the research question? So if you're undertaking, and you're wanting to find out in depth what people think or feel about something, you're probably not going to do a quantitative survey. It's more likely to be, in-depth interviewing. So will the design answer the research question is something they will ask themselves. Has a clear rationale been provided for the study design? Now that might be quite obvious, your first stop shop might always be an RCT, but if you are doing something a bit different, or it's actually logistically or ethically very difficult to do an RCT, you have to explain why you're not doing it, because the first thing they'll say is, why aren't you doing it? So if there's an obvious design and you're doing something that isn't quite obvious, you do need to say why. So be aware of that. And from a more sort of qualitative point of view, are the theoretical underpinnings of the design suited to the nature of the question? So are you getting that right? What are the relative strengths and weaknesses of the design approach options, I suppose, that you might have? And again, accepting that there are always weaknesses. So in an ideal world, you might say we do an RCT, but actually you're going to have to do a natural experiment. So what are the problems with natural experiments? Oh my goodness, systematic bias. So and how am I going to handle that? And reviewers will want to know. How does the design compare to alternatives? Have the researchers consulted appropriate methods experts? So this comes down to the discussions we were having yesterday about team, and we'll hear a bit more about that tomorrow. They're going to see what the big methodological chunks in your study are, and they're going to map those chunks onto your team. And if they see a gap, they're going to worry about it. So if there's a statistical component to your study, you need a statistician on the team. Have patient service users, carers, relevant stakeholders been involved in the design? They will want to see this. NIHR is exceedingly hot on this. If there isn't decent lived experience input into your study at the grant development stage, they will notice it, and it will count against you. And obviously, we need to keep our studies on track with what's important to patients. So they will be asking that question. And obviously, in terms of design, people will have views on design. That's not to say that patients would overrule a scientific decision necessarily, but there are aspects of the design, such as how you go about collecting data, how you go about maximizing research inclusion, where patients will have insight and useful advice to give you that you can take on board in terms of aspects of your design. Might there be any practical implications in attempting to implement the design? So, is what you're proposing basically feasible? Can you actually do it? It may be that you're being overambitious. It may be that actually in that sort of context, it's very difficult to implement that sort of design. So just be aware of the practical implications, especially within, service context, whether that's social care, public health, or NHS settings, there will be constraints and feasibility issues that you need to take into account in terms of your design. What methods are used to ensure rigor? So, that might be to do with, collecting the most appropriate things at the most appropriate times. It might be that you're going to instigate some sort of triangulation whereby you can double check the methods that you're using, etc. Where relevant, is there any chance of contamination between intervention and control arms if you are making a comparison? So a typical example might be if you were implementing a nursing intervention on a ward, are they going to chat to their fellow nurses about it? You can't really individually randomize nurses. You're probably going to have to randomize wards or hospitals. It becomes a much more complex situation. Are relevant confounders accounted for? So these are variables that will affect your outcome of interest that actually aren't really related to your intervention. But they will interfere with what you're trying to look at. Typical ones being things like smoking, age, sex, ethnicity. All these things can have an effect. And if you know that various factors are likely to influence your outcome, then you do need to say how you're going to deal with them. And that's usually either through design. So randomization is entirely designed to deal with that, or later on via analysis. But if you can design out your confounding, that is an excellent thing to do. Is the randomization procedure suitable? So, who's doing it? Have you got a CTU involved? Is it a proper randomization process that you're going through? Is it practical? Yeah, is there a clinical trials unit on board? Obviously not necessary for everything, but for some things. And again, from the qualitative point of view, what is the ontological and epistemological position of the work? And I'll refer any questions to my qualitative colleagues in relation to that, but it is an issue, it's got to fit the design. Are researchers familiar with the culture of participating organisations? So, if you're intending as part of your design to go into a particular situation, do you know what's what? Can you navigate your way around it? Do you understand the processes? Does the design use more than one method of data collection to facilitate the findings? So that's this notion, as I mentioned, triangulation, very commonly used in mixed methods research, where you're bringing data together to see whether they hold each other up. Basically, they confirm each other's findings, but with perhaps a different viewpoint. Are there any ethical issues in relation to the design that need consideration? So, if you're trying to evaluate something that's in common practice, it's going to be very difficult to randomize. If clinicians have a very strong preference for an intervention or a surgical technique, it's going to be very difficult to make them not do it in a randomized control trial, for example. So I've got some examples here. So, and we can think about the sorts of things that reviewers might think. So if we had a descriptive study examining health beliefs based only on a quantitative survey, well, I think I've sort of given you that earlier. Basically, the question would be, this is going to provide a lack of insight. If you're going to look in depth, you're going to need qualitative work. An RCT involving sham surgery, well, will patients agree to take part? You're going to expect them to undergo surgery of some sort for no good reason. An intervention run in 2 hospital wards compared to 2 control wards in the same hospital. Well, will intervention and control groups become contaminated? And of course, feasibility work can help inform those sorts of things. A study of nurse-patient interaction where patients are consented before and after interview, before and after are consented before and interviewed after the interaction of interest. Well, will researchers influence the intervention itself? So that's known as the Hawthorne effect. So, if you're trying to evaluate how well a health or social care professional is interacting with a patient, if you change that experience or that process by your actual research methods, you may skew or contaminate the results of your study. A before and after study of an intervention to reduce allergens in the home. Well, the sorts of things you might think about, well, are there seasonal patterns? There's no point taking a measurement in March and another one in September because, the allergens are going to be different. They're going to be seasonal. There'll be different things affecting people. So really, you probably need to have the same time of year as your 2 time points. And I've got one here, a quasi-experiment, basically a non-randomized experiment of an intervention in one site compared with a control site. I think the main thing that reviewers will think will be, are there systematic differences between the sites affecting outcomes? And of course, you can get cross-sectional differences, but you can also get longitudinal changes as well. So, a hospital might implement a policy, say you were trying to evaluate the impact of a intervention on pressure sore prevalence on wards. You might have your own intervention, but the hospitals may have different policies. They may introduce, some other intervention during that year that will affect the nursing care and that may influence the outcome of interest. So, ideally, you want to design these out, and if you can't, you deal with them down the line through analysis. But even then, if something is totally confounded, you'll never disentangle the effects of that with your intervention. So you have to be very cautious of those sorts of situations. So that's the study design. So sampling and recruitment. So this is sort of things like population, setting, sampling method, sample size, eligibility criteria, recruitment and consent. So what sorts of things will reviewers ask? Well, they're going to ask things like, does the stated population and setting relate sensibly to the research question? So, obviously, if you want to measure something in adults, you're not going to pediatric wards. Are sampling methods clearly stated and consistent with the research objectives? Is a sample size clear? They're always going to be looking for a sample size, whether it's qualitative or quantitative. They'll want an indication, certainly in both, as to what you're planning to do. Is a sample size justified on a theoretical, if it's qualitative, or statistical, if it's quantitative basis? And they'll want to see a calculation for that. What are the eligibility criteria, and sort of do they make sense, for what you're looking at? For example, if you're looking at an intervention that's targeting underserved populations, you probably are not going to have an intervention that also requires, I don't know, access to a digital technology that they're not likely to have, or if you don't provide a interpreter, etc., that's going to be an issue. And obviously that's not less to do with sampling and recruitment, but it will be something down the line, because you'll basically miss the most important population by your sampling. How, when, and by whom will eligibility criteria be applied? So when is this happening, and who's doing it, and how are you going to identify these people? Is the process of accessing, approaching, consenting, and enrolling potential participants ethical and suitable? Is recruitment likely to meet targets? An absolutely massive thing in studies. We'll have some examples tomorrow of how recruitment is a massive problem for studies, and you can fall flat on your face if you don't recruit as expected. And there's all sorts of groundwork you can do to check that you are likely to get the requisite numbers, and you can reassure reviewers. For example, you can look at the throughput of potential sites and apply your eligibility criteria and feasibility work to show that, in fact, there are enough people coming through. Have patients, carers, service users been consulted about the recruitment process? So does it make sense from their point of view? Have issues relating to research inclusion been addressed? So yes, getting back to this issue of making sure that, who are the people who are most affected by this condition? How can we make sure that we can recruit them? Because traditionally, perhaps those underserved populations aren't actually taking part in research. So are we doing outreach? Are we using translated materials, etc.? So some examples: a study comparing two treatments with an N of 20. Well, if it has any statistical ambitions, then an obvious thing is it's likely to need a bigger sample, and we need a proper sample size calculation to justify what you've got. A study looking at barriers and facilitators to quality improvement, interviewing patients and nursing staff. Well, we're talking about management as well here, so I think you do need all stakeholders involved. A study of rare diseases in only 3 sites. Well, reviewers will want to need details of prevalence, and there's a likelihood that you're going to need many more sites. So when we see studies of very rare diseases, they're not even going to be able to be done in the UK. They have to be European or worldwide studies simply because you can't get the patients. A study looking at access to healthcare that has no plans to recruit non-English speakers. So this is an example of what I was talking about. These are the very people you want to involve in your study, but you're not taking any measures to actually recruit them in terms of outreach, interpretation, and translation. A study of carers of people with dementia. So we need clear processes of how eligible people will be identified and consented. We've got one for you here, a study hoping to provide results to influence practice nationwide based on one rural general practice. Will this practice be representative of practices nationally? There's no point doing a detailed research project in one place that simply will have results that won't be translatable elsewhere. In terms of the intervention, so we're talking about if there is an intervention, obviously there isn't always. So what exactly is it, and what is the comparator going to be the main things that reviewers will be interested in? So the sorts of things they will ask will be, is the intervention clearly described? And you may find that a surprising question, because you think, well, of course the intervention will be described, but you'll be amazed at how many people don't describe it. Is the intervention novel? There's no point flogging a dead horse. Is this something genuinely new? What is the current evidence to support it? So obviously we're not looking for, what you're trying to do in this research project, which might be to evaluate it, maybe at some level, but there does need to be some indication that you haven't plucked this idea out of nowhere. So some proof of concept, feasibility work, initial observational work that has shown potential promise. Does it make sense for the group of interest? So, are you asking people to do, this patient group to do something sensible? What is the rationale for the dosing schedule? So, if you propose doing it X number of times a week or a month, then what's the reason for that? Is the timing of the intervention clear? What is the likelihood of the effect of other factors relative to the intervention? So again, this idea of confounding. Sometimes you might have quite a chain of events. You might have say a nursing quality assurance initiative that you're teaching to staff, which you hope will impact patients. You've got quite a chain of causation there. What about all the other things that can interfere with that process? Have the researchers considered the implications for the NHS? At the end of the day, if it's not going to work in the NHS, and that's what this research is supposed to be all about, reviewers will have questions. Can the intervention be applied properly and consistently? Can health or social care professionals administer it? Are staff training plans adequate, and how does that fit into everything? Will staff be happy to administer the intervention? Are staff experiences or preferences an issue, or that's rather like the surgery? If they're really wedded to something, are they going to be happy to not do it or to move on to something else? How will fidelity be ensured so that the staff are actually following the intervention as they're supposed to? Will patients, carers, and service users be happy to do it if it's aimed at them? Will participants adhere to the intervention? So if they're happy to do it, will they carry on doing it as instructed? Is the comparison group well described and sensible? People often forget to describe the comparison group, and sometimes it's not very easy. It might be NHS usual care, but then what do we mean by usual care? Is blinding or placebo necessary or possible? Are there any ethical issues in relation to the intervention? And some examples here, a study using an evidence-based CBT intervention for a new group of patients. Well, a question might be, is this really novel and interesting enough to fund? So we know CBT works, you're applying it to a new group. You've got to give a good reason why you might have to adapt it or change it for that group. The iterative development and testing of a training pack for nurses to help carers with patients with a long-term condition. So as with my other example, is the trail of causation clear and convincing? A study of an exercise package for patients with MS to be delivered over 6 months. So why the specific package? Why over 6 months? The dose and the rationale for it. Can we expect long-term fidelity from patients? an RCT of a novel surgical technique. So what is the evidence to support that technique? What is the evidence that surgeons can use that technique? Evidence that it's ready perhaps for an RCT, if that's what you're planning to do. And there are special frameworks, for example, the IDEAL framework for surgical interventions, which take on board the fact that there is a learning window for surgeons to take on new techniques. And so evaluating it at the start is not always the best time to do it. A study of a new drug for children with considerable side effects. Well, will patients and parents be willing to adhere to the treatment? Comparison of an intervention with treatment as usual. And as I say, it's simply not easy sometimes because different hospital trusts may have different treatments as usual. Then how do you deal with that? Are you going to define what is treatment as usual, or are you just going to be very pragmatic and say we'll go with what's usually used and compare that to our intervention? Either way, you've got to explain it to reviewers. So what about data collection? What will reviewers ask? Is it clear what types of data are being collected? Are the data types appropriate for meeting the research objectives? Is it clear what data methods are being used? Is it clear who will collect data, where and from whom? I know what you're all thinking. You're thinking, how do I fit all this in with the word count? Are the data being collected at sensible times in relation to what is being examined, so the intervention and follow-up? Is data collection sensible in relation to NHS structures and pathways? Are you going to get in the way of delivering care? Have other potential options been considered? So, considering other methods of doing it and whether they're better. Are potential weaknesses of approaches identified and addressed? Is data collection feasible? What's being proposed? Have the ethical implications been considered? Will missing data or poor quality data be an issue? If you're using big data, are permissions and timelines accounted for? Is the data collection process acceptable to patients, carers, service users? Is blinding necessary or feasible? Is sufficient expertise available to ensure data of suitable quality? So some examples here. A prognostic study examining risk factors for knee osteoarthritis using a routine database. Questions might be, are all important risk factors and confounders reliably recorded in the database? Will the researchers have access to the data in time for the study start? A study of risk factors for respiratory allergies using combined data from more than one routine data set. Well, can data be standardized across data sets, or have they just simply been collected in an incompatible way? Mixed staff and patient focus groups to explore implementation of a new multidisciplinary intervention in an NHS rehabilitation setting. Will patients and different staff disciplines and grades be happy to share thoughts in mixed groups, or should you actually have separate groups? An intervention study requiring working age patients to attend hospital daily in the morning for a blood test. Well, will patients be able to attend clinics that regularly? And one for you, a survey of health and lifestyles using smartphones for data collection. I don't know if you can think of possible problems with that. Digital poverty is obviously one thing. Are you immediately excluding a load of patients from your study? In terms of outcome measures, what reviewers will ask, are the outcome measures appropriate for the research question? Are they relevant for the patient, service user, carer, staff group of interest? Are the outcome measures acceptable to patients, service users, carers and staff, whoever you're asking of? Are the measures valid and reliable? Is the rationale for particular outcome measures clear? Are outcome measures sensitive to the intervention being evaluated? Do proxy measures where used correlate well with outcomes? Are the outcome measures properly referenced? Where relevant, is there a clear primary outcome? Where relevant, are outcome measures sensibly timetabled in relation to the intervention? And I've got a number of examples here. A study using an ADL measure, activities of daily living, for patients who are unable to walk. Well, will the ADL measure be sensitive enough? A comparison between two different interventions using an outcome measure derived from two others. How valid and reliable will this measure be if you've mucked around with initial validity and reliability testing? A study using a tool developed for adults in a pediatric ward, so how valid and reliable will the measure be for children? A study requiring patients to have 2 extra biopsies for histological assessment. Well, how acceptable would that be to patients? Using length of stay as the primary outcome in a study of a nursing quality intervention aimed at reducing pressure sores. Is length of stay, which is affected by many other things, a sensible primary outcome measure? Data analysis. Will the analysis help achieve the aims and objectives? Are the proposed methods suitable based on the type of data collection collected? Are the proposed methods suitable based on the sampling approach? How will the data be prepared for analysis? Is the analysis plan clear and thorough? Are appropriate guidelines or references highlighted? Is special methodological input required? Is blinding necessary or feasible? Does the analysis take into account confounding variables? Some examples: a randomized study comparing new and current treatment of bowel cancer based on percentage cancer-free at 6 months. A statistician would ask, would progression-free survival be preferable as a primary outcome? And does the analysis account for stratification factors? A study comparing outcomes at a number of times post-randomization. So does the analysis suitably account for repeated measures over time? An interpretive phenomenological analysis to explore how participants experience an intervention. Is that kind of theoretical approach required to answer the question? And a natural experiment comparing the outcomes of a new exercise intervention for patients with COPD running in one trust compared with standard care in another. Will all potential confounding variables be accounted for in the analysis? As I say, if you can design out confounding, excellent. If there are issues that remain, you have to deal with it in the analysis as best you can. A bit on project management, so sponsorship, ethics, management, data management, IP, timelines, the sorts of things reviewers will ask: is sponsorship appropriate, and is it clear that ethics and governance principles can be upheld? Are all other relevant permissions and approvals in hand? Is the proposed work feasible in the time allocated? Are the stages of the study in a sensible order? Has the researcher given themselves enough time and funding for each step? Do they have the right researchers in place in the right time, at the right place and time? Have they got the right materials, equipment, and space they need? How will data be entered and managed? Do arrangements for transcribing and storing interviews and focus groups and other data meet the criteria for GDPR? Have all quality assurance issues been considered properly? Have researchers considered the logistical implications of sample transport and storage? Do the researchers have freedom to operate? That's an IP term, meaning can they actually use an intervention, or perhaps they've got software or something they've used from somewhere else? Do they have the right to use it? Do Gantt charts and flow diagrams make sense? Have they got the support of other relevant organizations? Overall, will the project be well managed and will it deliver? Some examples: 1 month set aside to obtain NHS ethics approval. Well, is it going to take longer than that? Will the study fall behind schedule and have time to do all the important things? A study of people with severe mental health difficulties. Have consent procedures been thoroughly considered with reference to appropriate ethics and other guidance? A study examining MRI images of the brain taken monthly over 6 months in 30 patients. Is access to MRI planned appropriately and agreed with whoever's doing it for you? An RCT followed by a qualitative sub-study. Could the qualitative work run alongside the RCT to reduce the length of study? And finally, a home-based physiotherapy intervention involving 100 patients and data collection over 3 weeks. Is this logistically possible? Is the research delivery network involved? Actually, there is more. A clinical trial to evaluate a repurposed drug for a new patient group. So have NIHR costs and permissions been considered? Have researchers considered suppliers, packaging and placebo? Do they have CTU involvement? Is the pharmacy on board? Is there a data monitoring and ethics committee? A study involving the regular collection of tissue samples. Have storage and transport issues been considered? Have issues related to the Human Tissue Act been considered? A study developing a new device for taking biopsies. I think as a reviewer, I think you would want to know all of those things, and obviously safety issues are covered by ensuring that appropriate regulatory requirements are being addressed, which is something that you'd always look out for. And are there measures in place to capture intellectual property? And I'm sure that some of the other things you were saying were relevant as well.